Okay, thank you everyone for coming today and welcome to our first in our AI in Learning and Teaching series for 2025, which is jointly hosted with Sciences Group. So our first speaker for today, we thank you very kindly for stepping up, rather more last minute than what we might have liked planned because we've had a few people pull out, is Jason, and he will be speaking to us about, I thought this title, I'm so well prepared, exploring AI technologies to replicate and augment teaching practices, a planned obsolescence. So before I turn to that, can I just acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we are currently standing and for which you may be sitting on your Tinsley, and pay respect to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The series consists of 5 presentations across the year, so keep your eye out for the next dates. Our next one is on May 20th, and it's from the presenters from the School of Environmental Sciences. Quite the cool speakers from across the different disciplines at the university, so it's not just all technology, which probably you might have seen, and so we can actually demonstrate and explain how these tools can be used across a whole range of different kinds of endeavours in the learning and teaching space. So Jason joins us from the School of Education and Professional Studies, where he's the Director of the Bachelor of Education, with all its re-registration and accreditation requirements. But he has spent some time, a rather long journey, he told me it was 30 years
Yep.
in this kind of space. Around expert systems, neural networks, adaptive learning systems, intelligent tutoring systems, and so on. And he's going to walk us a little bit through some of that kind of exploration and journey that he's been doing and how he's been looking at AI tools in his learning and teaching practice. Jason.
Thank you very much. Just got to get rid of... Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name's Jason Zagami, as you've just heard. I've been teaching in the space of educational technologies now for quite some time. And in this session, we're looking at the question as to when AI will replace myself. So this may be a question you're considering as well around AI. It's sort of a concern that's often raised that at some stage we're going to be obsolete. Now, back in the 1990s and 1980s, it's when I started my trajectory into AI. In fact, at Griffith University, at Nathan campus, I was doing a physics degree, maths physics degree, and we were learning Prolog and Lisp and the AI-based languages. And from that, when I went into education, I started developing expert systems to tutor students, particularly mathematics. Mathematics at the time was quite complex. They were about to introduce a whole new system of mathematics, and they wanted a whole system of tutorials that would also then differentiate students' progress. So based upon their previous questions, it would then determine what the next question should be, harder or easier or a different set. So that was the state of play back in the early 90s. Then in the 2000s, I was lucky to be at a school where we were able to get a robot dog. It was Abo from Sony, and it was named Gigabyte. And it was an experimental dog put out by Sony that was actually incredibly advanced for its time. It was comparable to some of the $1 million humanoid robots that were being experimented with in a not cheap, but not super expensive package. So the special thing about this was you didn't program it. It learnt by trial and error. Just as a baby learns, it learns through positive and negative reinforcement. So its neural network is trained by that experiential process. And the students, well, it has these processes where it tries to find attention. So if students are patting it and it's doing something, it will reinforce that behaviour. If it's doing something that they don't want it to do, they would ignore it. And over about a 6-month period, the robot dog learned how to crawl and then walk. all without any programming at all. So it's based on its attention-seeking strategies, trying to find human beings to interact with and receive positive feedback from. And it developed various techniques such as pattern recognition. It could use its microphones to detect where people were speaking from and move towards them. It could use its vision system. In fact, it got so used to pattern recognition, it would identify certain students, and those that it knew would give it more attention. It would play favourites and go to those in the classroom, which caused some consternation between the students. But this process helped teach the students about AI use. So what I'm trying to establish here is that AI use is much broader than just generative AI and large language models. There's a whole scope of AI use. This was the next experiment when I became an academic, and this is the now Android. And I've used this to give entire lectures. Before COVID, when we actually had lectures, it was, the thing at the time was active learning, where you engage students during the lecture process with activities that they were involved with, rather than passively sitting back and hearing a lecture. Now that was always difficult when you were one lecturer in a room of 100-odd students. So by shifting the lecturing to the Android, where it talked to the students, talked them through the slides and progressed the slides and gave instructions for the activity, I was able to move around the lecture theatre to the various groups of students as they did activities, giving them support and encouragement through those processes. And so we had that team teaching process. The other advantage was that these were beginning teachers. So I was trying to reinforce with them that the main focus of teaching is not the presentation of information. It's the relationships and the engagement, the interactions with the students. And this was a fairly visceral way of demonstrating that. Now, we're having a little trouble with the audio, so I'm not sure this will work properly, but this is now starting a lecture, done on a 360 camera, so it was used for research purposes. But the problem with now, while he has very good body language and he can do good intonations with his voice, etc., he doesn't have very much facial expression. He can have different lights going off and he can do different head movements and turns and so forth, but it wasn't getting across a lot of the expression that I hope to achieve. And it was also the lack of audio clarity. Even if I set up various speaker systems and amplifiers and so forth, it was never sufficient audio to really engage the students, particularly in a large lecture theatre. And facilities didn't like me playing around too much with the audio systems in the lecture rooms. So this is one I've been working on for a few years now. For about 4 years, I've been working with the developers of Little Sophia. Sophia the robot is the world's leading humanoid android in terms of interactions with other people. Looks like a large person, and she goes around the world doing demonstrations at various events around robotics. Little Sophia is being designed for a young children's audience, but the advantage that I want to take use of is it's got very good facial expressions. It can do a whole range of different facial engagements and can interact with students in a much more positive way than robots like now, which are very robotic. Now, also along this journey for the last 10 years, 10, 12 years or so, I've been developing chatbots. Now, over that time, they've slowly developed in complexity based upon students' questions that they ask during courses and the answers and feedback they receive about those answers. And so they've been progressively trained into the expert system of chatbots. Now, I use the Bot Libra system, and they were developing quite well. They were sort of like a help desk type system. You could ask it specific questions, it would give you specific answers. But you had to be quite close in the terms you used. Didn't have to be exact, but it had to be close. And the responses were likewise fairly constrained. There was only about 500 set responses. There was several thousand additional responses to generic sort of questions like, how are you? But course-related responses were limited. And then into 2021, I started looking at ways of linking those chatbots together in a way that had a more cognitive model around it. And I was using agent-based system modeling to manage a whole series of chatbots that would focus on particular concepts. And not to go into too much detail, because essentially I gave up on this. Of course, in 2022, along came ChatGTP, and it was very clear that this just couldn't compete. There was now something available that was far superior. Still looking at agent-based modeling to manage some aspects of ChatGTP, but there just wasn't a need for small language models when we have the large language models. So the first thing I did with ChatGTP was to develop AI summaries. So taking the course notes and producing a summary page of those notes. And likewise for the readings, taking the readings that they would have to do, and normally, particularly for the master's courses, we would have 4 or 5 readings a week, and we would go through those during the tutorials. But invariably, students weren't necessarily doing the readings. So we ended up just having to re-go over the readings, and it defeated the point of the tutorials to a large extent. By providing them with these summaries, students could then just read the summaries, even a few minutes before the tutorial, and have sufficient understanding to engage with the tutorial. The other aspect was, because I now had the ability to get them to look at the summaries, I could give them more readings. And so it went from 4 or 5 readings to about 20 readings, but the expectation was that they would only engage with 1 or 2 of those readings in any depth. And they could lead the discussions around those particular readings in the tutorials. So that was the first approach I took to that, and to make it easy for students, because students could do it on their own if they knew how, there would be the link to the ChatGTP summary, which would take them to ChatGTP, give them the summary in ChatGTP, but also they could then query the actual response. So they could ask follow-up questions live in the ChatGTP instance. So if they wanted to know more about some aspect of the reading, they could do that in a very rapid way. And the students quite engaged with that. And we saw about a 70% increase in preparation for the tutorials as a result of that, which was nice. Then in 2023, I was noticing that there was a problem that they were engaging with all of the readings, but they weren't necessarily linking different concepts together. Of course, we're giving lots and lots of different concepts, but the big picture was missing from them. And they weren't able to conceptualize how these various things were interrelating sufficiently. So the approach I looked at was through narrative learning or storytelling. And so it was an approach I'd used about 15 years before in a thing called programming fairy tales, which was a whole lot of programming problems turned into fairy tales. But it was always too much time to write fairy tales for all the concepts in a course. But now with ChatGTP along, I could use it to take my course notes, turn them into a fairy tale that the students can more engage with, and can be done with any genre. This particular course was looking at primary school teachers, so it was focused around fairy tales, because that's something that they're teaching and using in their own teaching. So the idea was that they would read through these fairy tales and they would get a narrative across the various content of the course. And it was good because it linked various concepts quite nicely. The problem was, though, with 200 or so fairy tales, developing a narrative across all of that arc that ChatGTP could maintain some consistency with was quite challenging. And there were a whole range of techniques that I developed over the period of time. Now, with custom GPTs, you can just put all the previous fairy tales in a folder and you can then develop out from that. But in 2022, that didn't exist. So we had to resort to other techniques to progressively build an ongoing narrative. So we had one character and they were slowly developing from very hesitant in their teaching and their exploration through to very confident and engaged, ready to go to the profession. Now, during that period of time, for my sins, I was given a program directorship of the Bachelor of Education. Now, this has got around 2,500 students in it, and because of the complexity of the Bachelor of Education, they almost all need to have individualised study plans, which is a huge amount of work. We have PSO support and so forth, but it's challenging. So, being involved in educational technologies, I looked to see whether or not ChatGPT could do anything about that. Spent quite a bit of time looking at large language models and their way of engaging with that sort of information, and could never get above 70% accuracy. And it really needs close to 100% accuracy, because incorrect decisions mean that they can't then do certain courses and progress properly in their degree program. So again, there are many different forms of AI. And this is using CPSAT, which is a way of developing optimal pathways. And this is what I'm currently exploring as the most efficient way of students being able to put in their choice of subjects. In the Bachelor of Education for the secondary students, there's something like, how many have I got? There's 165 courses. They choose 12 of those, and all of those combinations, it's in the gigabyte numbers of combinations. So having a system that can develop pathways that meet all of the course rules within that process and can check students' study plans and help them develop student study plans was the intent. But that's sort of admin, and we're not really here to talk about that. We're talking about teaching and learning. So I'd been exploring from a number of years when AI would be able to do all of the things that a pre-service teacher is expected to do when they graduate. We have very detailed graduate standards that the teachers have to be able to demonstrate. They're very well established. And up until ChatGPT, we were around about 40% that AI tools could replicate. ChatGPT's come along and it's now pretty much 100%, which is a bit of a problem. Now, I'll talk about some solutions to that, but realising that, I wanted to see for myself just what the potential was for these tools to do my job in terms of teaching. So I set the challenge. I was given a course to teach at the last sort of minute, sort of 4 weeks before to be taught. And so I thought, okay, let's see what can be done. So I started off with the planning process. It's a 12-week master's course. I was given the title and 3 learning outcomes, learning objectives, develop up a unit outline for this course. And it went away and did up quite a nice unit outline. Now, I had given it 20 existing courses that I'd previously done. So it definitely designed the course around my style of course development and how I would generally go about preparing a course. But it was completely new content. I'd never done a course focusing on culture before. Technology and education sort of fine, but the cultural aspect was new. So having it then create the outline, it was then a matter of going, okay, for this first week that is described, develop up the content for that week. Develop up all the content, develop up the readings, develop up the activities for use in the tutorials. I'm currently using a lot of the Lucid chart tool because it integrates nicely with Canvas and links to their, integrates nicely with Teams, and it links to their Teams account, so you know who's done what in the actual whiteboard, for want of a better word, that is Lucid chart. So this was then able to generate all of that content, some 200 pages of content, probably about 800 readings, and lots of other resources that were to do with designing the course. Somewhat disappointing because that's the stuff I really like doing. So have an AI come along and do all that stuff is a little bit confronting, but it was good to see just what it can do in that sort of contextual space. Now, it's a well-established space. If you were doing this for something that's very, very esoteric, there wouldn't be sufficient data points for it to be able to necessarily do all of that. But certainly for undergraduate and for some of the low-level stuff in the master's programs, it's well within its database capacity to develop up course programs and content for those courses. Then, of course, I needed some images. So developed up about 250 images. My favourite tool is ImageFX, which is a Google tool. Of course, it creates sort of photorealistic images, and that's sort of what I like to use in my courses. And then came the next, well, that's what took me up to the beginning or the end of last year. This year, I wanted to see if I could go even further. Of course, up to then, I'd done the lecture recordings and the tutorials were just happening as normal. So now I asked it to develop up transcripts that I could speak to during the lecture and also how I could run the tutorials. Now, not wanting to actually read out a transcript so much, I then duplicated my voice. So this is a tool, quite a few of the tools do this now, some of the ones integrated with other tools. This is the best I've found, particularly cheap, or zero cost for this one. And it was able to train on my voice, and after about half an hour of training, it's able to replicate my voice reasonably well. Generally around about 90%. 80%, no problems at all. About 10%, it's a little bit dodgy, and it's still about 10% where it fumbles over words and intonations. It will raise an intonation or lower it just in the wrong spot, and you can sort of tell it's a little bit off. I also extracted audio from my existing videos because what I wanted to do was allow students to experience both my voice being recorded, having been previously recorded, and AI-generated voice to see if they could tell the difference. What I then did was duplicate myself. Now, these aren't the duplicates yet. These are just examples of my existing videos, just to show how variable they can be, depending upon the lighting, what I'm wearing, whole range of different factors. There's not much consistency between the videos. But I've used a tool called HeyGen that allows me to create these avatars. So that's how I've been trained. You can see I wear the same shirt for all my videos, so I can use them each year. I'm really worried about when my shirt dies, but. And I'm going to play the two avatars now and see if you can pick which one is using the AI voice and which one is using my recorded voice. Now you'll have to be, the audio is not great at the moment, so see how we go. So who says it's the first one is the AI? Who says the second one? The AI was the first one. But it's relatively hard for the students to pick up. Not impossible though, as it goes over a long period of time, the little errors that it makes do become noticeable. Now this is still very, very new technology. Didn't exist at the beginning of this year, started to exist halfway through the year. Certainly in the free versions. You can pay a lot of money to get really professionally done ones, but remember these are trained on my voice. They're not using a generated voice, which is much higher quality. They do it in studios and train it for days. This is trained on 30 minutes on my voice. Likewise, these are AI generated avatars, again trained with about 30 minutes of viewing myself, turning my head different ways and so forth, and being able to then use. Now the advantage of this is I can pop out 20 or so videos an evening while I'm watching TV. So it's just a matter of clicking on things, copying and pasting stuff in, and waiting for it to upload and process. So the actual effort involved is quite negligible. Still takes a reasonable amount of time. Of course, we can't, all the processes aren't necessarily automated, and I do use different tools which are, you can do the audio generation in HeyGen, but it doesn't do anywhere near the quality that I was hoping for. So that's sort of an approach to replacing the video aspect of teaching. Oops. They have a mind of their own. Now, this semester I'm also looking at expanding that, because one of the issues I've faced with our master's courses is reluctant speakers in the tutorials, particularly if they're from another culture where they have hesitancy about speaking up. They're perfectly capable of speaking up. They certainly know the material and can engage properly, but they're reluctant to do so. So one way of assisting with that is modelling, left is the two AIs that actually talk to each other. Now, what I'm hoping to do, they haven't quite released the opportunity to do it yet, but the capability will certainly be there soon, is have myself as the top AI and the author of the reading as the second AI, where I train it up on some video I can find from the author and their voice and duplicate them for a conversation between the two, so that the students can get used to that prompting and then start engaging with their own contributions to the conversations. Likewise, there are now more advanced chatbots linked to generative AI that the students can converse with in real time and ask questions of. And so again, we'll be looking at doing the authors as those so that the students can query questions from that. Technology that's still evolving, and at the moment you can't use your own avatars for those processes, but that should change within the next 6 months or so. Okay, then there's the issue of assessment, always near and dear to everyone's heart around AI. So how have I approached this? Well, first off, for the course that I was developing from scratch, I asked it to develop the assessment tasks. And part of that was to also develop it so that it was going to be difficult to address using generative AI tools. And it came out with various techniques. Where is it? So why this task resists AI generation? So they've got to submit screenshots and documentations of their own behaviour, reflections on personal engagement, demonstrating connections to class readings, etc. So it's made some attempt to inoculate the assessment task. Now, I don't like that approach. I don't think it's sustainable. In the future, we need to accept that AI is going to be able to do many of the tasks that we've previously assessed students on. So the question then becomes, what do we do about that? But first, there's marking. Now, always an interesting issue, particularly for students. So I use a process of co-marking. I mark the assignment. I then get an AI tool to mark the assignment, and I've used a whole range of them, and do inter-rater reliability, compare the effectiveness of the marking. And generally, the AI is around about 90% inter-rater reliability, which is very, very high. Now, it is an AI that I've trained, and it's got about 5 pages of prompts on how to do assessment, but it's still very, very high compared to a 60% rating, which is what would normally be considered acceptable for 2 human markers to achieve. So AI is able to co-mark very effectively. I've not yet been game just to allow it to mark, because I have some ethics, but it certainly looks as though it's going to be capable of doing that process. Yay. The big thing, though, it does really, really well is provide feedback. Now, in the past, I would normally give about 2 or 3 paragraphs of feedback. Now I provide 5 pages of feedback. Detailed feedback specific to the student, addressing specific issues in their assignment. Really useful feedback. Never had time to do that previously, not when you're doing a class of a couple hundred students. So that has been a huge difference. These are just some of the feedback from one student for one task. But I've come across a problem. My students are doing too well. Now, in the past, it's never been too much of a problem. I've been able to accept and get passed through assessment boards, all the students getting 7s. That's not my issue. It's when they all get 100% for all the criteria, that becomes a big issue. The assessment is not coping with differentiating the students. Now, I've got fixed learning outcomes, the standards that are required for students to demonstrate. So I can't necessarily change those. So I'm exploring ways of addressing that particular conundrum. Now, to help explain the issue, back when I went through university, you were basically assessed on your ability to find information. The quality of the university and the quality of your home was how big a library you had and how recent your set of encyclopedia was. And that gave you competitive advantage. And you went to a better university because they had a better library. That then changed with the internet, and in particular with Wikipedia. It reframed assessment. It took a while and no one really noticed it for a bit, but we completely changed the way we assessed. And we went to process training. So now, instead of assessing their ability to find information and write about it, we provide them with a set of tasks that they have to demonstrate, assessment tasks. How to do well in an exam, how to write a model assignment, how to write a model science report. And these are the processes that are differentiating our students. Now, in schools, they've gone even further. They've got what are called cognitive verbs. There's about 20 or so of these, and students are trained to generalise, or to develop, or to elaborate, or to evaluate. And they receive specific training throughout all their courses, and then they're assessed on their ability to do these things. But there's one big problem. It's independent of the content to a large degree. Some of them relate to the content somewhat, but a student that masters assessment will then generally be able to do well in any course. But if they haven't mastered it, they're not going to do well in that course, regardless of how much they understand the content. And the emperor has no clothes moment came with generative AI. Of course, generative AI is incredibly good at following these processes. You ask it to infer and develop a response, inferring to whatever the question is, it will develop a wonderful model response because it's got all this training data based on producing those responses. So our continuation of assessing processes is very much now under threat. So the question is, where do we go then from that? One approach is the competency performance approach. Students demonstrating that they can do something. And it's not so much if they've learnt stuff, it's just whether or not they can demonstrate something. Very much in vogue in vocational education, very effective for lower order thinking skills. Knowledge recall, basic process following. But it breaks down when assessing higher order thinking skills, such as analysis and synthesis and creativity. Of course, those are harder to just demonstrate something at. The other approach that I've been looking at is disposition demonstration. This is taking the idea that each of our professions has a certain disposition, a way of doing that profession, a way of being that professional. A doctor has a certain way of thinking and behaving and doing things that is different to a lawyer or a musician or a teacher. And these are what actually frame what it is to be a professional in that particular discipline. Now in teaching, we have those described. We have them explicitly described for us for graduate teachers, but also we have those same standards described for each level increasing all the way up through to principals. We've got highly accomplished teachers, lead teachers, etc. So what I've been looking at is creating digital twins of my students that are trained on all of the course knowledge, trained to treat their students as apprentices, and to encourage them, to guide them in their learning, to assist them to understand, and to be able to demonstrate as good as the AI can do. So it's no longer treating it as a tool, it's treating it as a mentor. or if we want to use the terminology of apprenticeships, it's their master. Not a great word, but master apprenticeship is the sort of the terminology. That reframes the relationship the students have with the AI tools. So this is the digital twin of one of my students, Travis. He then is apprenticed to that digital twin who knows much more than he does about all of the curriculum, all the stuff that they're learning in teacher education. And it helps guide him through the various tasks and assessment items. It's trained on a whole lot of inputs, but most importantly, it's trained on personal information about the student. Now, not what's the word, critical personal information. They provide an introduction when they start the course. They introduce themselves, what they like, what they're interested in, why they're doing that particular course, those sort of things. This then allows the AI to respond in a personal way, similar to how the student would respond. And the students have remarked about how much the AI seems to know about how they would like things to be done before they even tell it. Because it's trained to be that student and to respond as that student would, while also guiding them in that apprenticeship master model. So this is the actual prompt. You are the digital twin of a pre-service teacher named Travis. Your responses should always be encouraging, reflection, and should always encourage reflection and improvement. Where is it? In your guidance, tap into Travis's interests and strengths, helping him build confidence in teaching digital technologies, facilitate discussions, and so forth. So it provides a very proactive engagement, different to just querying a GPT. Now, because this is leading into their assessment, it presents some additional challenges. As I mentioned before, students are maxing out on the criteria. So instead of trying to make more difficult criteria, what I've decided to use the professional criteria, which we have, it extends all the way through to highly accomplished and lead teachers, and assess students on their ability to be a professional in that profession. So the graduate standards are the passing mark. The higher standards are what I want to see students aim towards achieving. Now, there's a few teething problems around it, but they are engaging with it. And some big benefits is they're really engaged with the online discussion, because it's now forming a key part of their assessment. How much they help each other, how much they show initiative, how much they show leadership is all forming part of their assessment. They're forming study groups and doing a whole lot of things that I've always wanted them to do, but there's never been that assessment impetus to actually encourage them to do so. But I have the standards from AITSA, which is our accrediting body for teacher education. It sets out the expectations of students. Normally we only stop at graduate level, but because they're now able to demonstrate graduate level very easily, we can now explore some additional standard levels. The other advantage this has is because the GPTs are mine, I can actually go in and see all the queries that students have made of their digital twin. Now, I've told them this, but I'm not sort of exploiting it too much, but I can use that also to see whether or not they're showing initiative and creativity and other aspects that can relate to their assessment. Of course, if you know anything about ChatGPT, it gives you a full detail of every query you've ever made and all the responses. It was great preparing this. I was able to go back 2 years and find out what queries I was making 2 years ago and bring it all back up. So it's quite a nice archiving tool in that respect. But also it's great, it's very useful to have a record of how students are engaging with the tool and the uses that they're getting from it. Now, it is challenging though, because it's continuous assessment, not something students necessarily like. It's collaboration, have to interact with each other. Some students don't like that. And they need to show leadership and initiative. So some things I'm still working through, but in the main, it seems to be holding together. So what about the future? Next semester. One of the things I've been looking at, one is academic efficacy. I've been quite concerned that our very high performing students may be suffering concern that they've achieved all of the success by being able to do test taking and assignment writing and all the rest, and suddenly now there's a tool that can do all of that as well. In fact, sometimes better than they can. How is their sense of self being affected by the availability of these tools? So currently I've got a survey out, got about 600 responses so far across the uni looking at it. And at the moment, it doesn't look as though it's affecting them too much, which is good news, but it's still very early days for the use of a lot of this technology, and some of them may not be doing so. And in fact, there were two very strong camps. One is those that don't want to have anything at all to do with AI, and those that want to do lots and lots of AI stuff. And not that much in the middle, which is a little bit worrying. So there's, in terms of our overall student population, I haven't delved down into all the different subcategories and faculties and all the rest yet, but it is starting to show that there's, the problem I thought might be there doesn't look as though it's there, which is good, but there may be other problems. The other thing I'm looking at doing in term 2 is agentive twins. This is where the generative AI is given agency. It's able to communicate to the students. Now, at the moment I'm not sure how to set it up so it can send emails to the students, but it can provide me with what to send to the students in an active way. When the students query it, it will start telling them what they should be then doing. Not just responding to a query, but actively looking at ways that the student should improve. Now, I'm still developing all the prompts for it, but it's taking on a very agentive process where it's actually initiating the guidance for the student, rather than the student having to initiate the request for assistance. And again, that changes the dynamics of the master apprenticeship model. So it comes back to the original question, will I be now obsolete? And it's nice to think so, but the reality is we fill our time with what's available. Because I've now been able to automate a lot of processes, I now have time to do other things, improve the videos, develop more activities, more readings. So the quantum of time doesn't necessarily change. And that's a common experience with new technologies. We think that it's going to make everything super wonderful because what we were doing disappears, but we find new things to do. And that's the short-term message about AI, certainly AI technologies. Realising though that we still are some way off true AI, artificial intelligence that's truly agentic, that can actually come into this classroom and say, no, you're talking rubbish, this is what AI should be happening in schools. That will happen soon. Could be 5 years, could be 10, could be some secret labs doing it now. We don't quite know exactly when that will occur, but if anything can be learnt from ChatGPT was how rapidly things can happen with overnight successes. No one expected ChatGPT to be as successful as it was. ChatGPT didn't expect it to be successful. Certainly Elon Musk, having divested himself of it only a few months before, didn't expect it to be so successful. There's a lot of things happening in this space that are very experimental. So locking ourselves into one particular approach or one particular technology at this stage of development is very risky because it could be very much outdated in a short period of time. And that's a link to the slide presentation, which also has slide notes. Not that I followed them too closely, but also a web link to my website that has all of my research and course notes and course material on there. And I believe we have time for a few questions.
Well, before we thank Jason, for what is in some ways a provocative presentation, but really I think raise issues about what learning and teaching actually means and what it is that we want for our students. We live in a a world which has got very rapid change around technology and what it can do. We can't ignore that. So the question becomes, what's our role in how this folds into the learning and teaching experiences? We've got some people online too, so Vanessa, you okay to keep an eye on the questions if anything comes up? So I'll just open it up.
I'm curious. I have a couple of chatbots that I've put into my course at the moment, and I've got a few students that have never used any AI before. So, and the same thing, because I'm using Cogniti, so I can actually go in there, I can have a look at their chats. It's de-identified, but I can see the conversation. I have a persona in there. Professor Wombat was a bit of a goose, tells bad dad jokes. But I also monitored last year their interactions with Chat AI and the questions, and I'm a little bit alarmed with the turn that I found. I wonder if you found the same thing. I found last year when they used to interact with it, it was humanised, which I didn't have that much of a problem with, but they were, please could you tell me, that's great, thank you, interacting with it quite now. Now, they don't even ask questions, they just type a word. They will just, if I want to ask about Zwitter-Ryans, they don't even say, can you tell me about Zwitter-Ryans? They just write Zwitter-Ryan. And now Professor Wombat takes them through and says, great question, gives them an analogy, asks them a question. Last year, they would feel compelled to answer the question because it was you asked me, I feel compelled to answer you. This year, they're just ignoring it. It's great that they're not humanising it, but I'm finding it's leading into personal interactions. I'm finding that when they speak, we interact, they're using that same terminology. They would put their hands up and they'll say, Zwitter-Ryans. Whoa. Now, I've found that it's quite pronounced. I'm just wondering if you've found the same thing.
No, probably the opposite. Students are conversing a lot more.
Really?
Yeah, well, of course it's linked to their assessment. That certainly is an encouraging factor. But no, in the past it has been times when I've had to sort of draw fingernails to get certain responses. But there's still some challenge around our reluctant speakers, particularly the international students. But most of them are now quite keen to, some of them probably to, probably the most extreme is some I have to actually stop speaking because they're just reading out ChatGPT responses. And I say, well, that's not really appropriate. We can do some other aspects around discussions for that. But no, they're quite...
Oh, okay.
I think the summaries have helped too because they feel confident that they at least know something about what they're talking about, rather than the past, if it's a large reading, knowing what we're going to be talking about from that reading can be a bit challenging. The summaries have helped from that perspective.
I find it fascinating that you've gone from your experience of way back until now. It's wonderful to see that progression. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting just to go through this reflective process myself in preparing for this.
Super interesting.
Any other questions? Yep, Beck.
I was just going to pick up on that because one of my questions was, do you find you have to do much training with the students in terms of the prompts? And, you know, we hear about prompt engineers or even just understanding how AI has changed the way we search. So is there much need, and maybe, again, it's different depending on disciplines or where it's being placed in the course, but teaching people how to, if you search more effectively, you'll get better information back.
Yes, no, originally that was one of my concerns, and I built a lot of self-prompting into my prompt. So it's being given instructions on how to ask questions of the students and to get them to elaborate and provide leading questions so they go into more depth around various concepts. So it's very much, it won't give the direct answer. It will take them through a process of deriving an understanding of a concept without just doing it as a search engine, which many of them do initially think it might be like that. But I also give them some instruction around how generative AI works in terms of it's not particularly effective as a search engine unless there's a lot of information out there that's exactly what you want to find, in which case you probably should be using a search engine anyhow. It's fantastic at doing approximations and developing stories because that's what it was designed to do. It was never designed to give factual information. It's just it's proven to be so good at doing these stories, people are using it to also as a factual checker and search engine type tool. And to be fair, they're now starting to try to build them to do that. Like they're making mathematics GPTs, which are trained on all the different possible mathematical problems. But in the past, it was just a few mathematics problems that might have been in text on the internet that it was basing all of its calculations on. And if there's two wildly different calculations, it's going to pick something in the middle. And obviously then it's going to be incorrect.
So we have a couple of questions online.
Yep.
So the first is about access to the tools that you've used, or you mentioned in your presentation, and how you might go about seeking official approval of the tools in an agile way. So it's about access to the tools.
Okay, well, in terms of access, all of them are free except for HeyGen. I was using that with a consultancy project, and it has about $300 a year. So it's not that expensive, but normally I try to explicitly only use free tools. Of course, I also tend to use them with my students, and they then need to be free for the students to be able to use. So I try to force myself just to use the free tools, but that's one exception in terms of the video quality, because I haven't found an AI avatar generator that can do myself as effectively. I know Adobe's working on it, so that will then become part of the university access once Adobe releases their AI avatar generator, but they haven't done so yet.
That'll reduce our sessional budgets.
Casual.
Oh. Willingness.
Just picking up on that though, then is there any issues you find with integration for those that are using a lot of AI tools? Like, because as you mentioned, it's then quite a creative workflow. You've actually got lots of different pieces that you're curating together. Is there any hurdles you hit with the university system with integrating that?
I've got a workflow process. It's actually, what I'm currently using is in Google Chrome. You can set up tab libraries, and all the steps are a different tab to a different web page. And I just go along, and when I need to access it again, I bring up that tab library and brings up all the different tools. And I just start with one tool. It then gives the requirements for the next tool and just move along that process. And it ends in Canvas. So that's how I tend to work through it. And it helps because I tend to be working concurrently on about 10 or so at once. So they're all in different stages in that progression, and having them all set out that way, I just know that, okay, this is it now there, so the next step is that.
So online, they found in ICT that there was student resistance arising from a fear that teachers were handing off their education to AI bots. Did you experience something similar?
So what was the...
So student resistance.
Okay, yes.
Teachers handing it all over to an AI bot. Did you see something similar in your case?
Yes and no. I tend to teach technology-related subjects. So by the nature of the subjects, they tend to have some affinity or at least interest with educational technologies, of which AI is part. So I'm a little bit insulated from that perspective. But this year, for the first time, I did have a student withdraw from the course because this was before we even started. Of course, he didn't want to do a course that had anything to do with AI, even learning about AI. So that was quite new, but that's something that I am a bit concerned about, particularly from the study that I'm doing looking at student data across the university, that there does seem to be quite a lot of students that are framing themselves as AI resistant or AI resistors, and how then that will affect assessment and other uses of AI in broader context is going to be challenging. I do think it's going to go away though, because almost all productivity tools are now incorporating AI aspects. So unless you give up Office and pretty much everything else, you're using AI fairly extensively.
Let me go back to the little robotic dog. Did it pick up humanised responses? Like, did it start to back away from people that were a bit?
No, there was a strict rule that they could never abuse the dog.
Oh, was there?
So the rule was they could praise the dog,
Yep.
or they could ignore the dog. That was the two training paradigms. Yeah, there was no punishment. Yep. So it would be attracted to those that praised it. It would ignore those that ignored it.
Did they do studies, do you know, on negative things with that dog? Because I know they had a few, didn't they? That they...
Oh, I'm sure there probably has been. I just didn't do it.
Yeah.
It just wasn't something I wanted to do with students.
Yeah. That was very cool. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, sorry.
How did the students react to the AI generated feedback? Because I can imagine students have handed in AI work and then AI was it positive, negative?
No, it was overwhelmingly positive. Because we talked it through then in the tutorials, what they should do, as I normally do in response to the feedback, particularly after their first assignment. And they were very appreciative of having a very clear roadmap of specific things that they could do. The feedback also related to the second assignment. So it told them these are the things they need to address in order to do better in the second assignment. So, and because it was just so comprehensive, no one complained about it at all. Yeah.
Related to feedback, someone's asked online how you developed the feedback, AI feedback. Did you develop your own app, or did you de-identify student papers and put it through ChatGPT?
Okay, it's through a custom GPT, so it doesn't actually go, the data that's incorporated in that doesn't go off for training models and so forth. And it's also, within that custom GPT, it's trained on a whole lot of aspects around how I do assessment. There's a whole lot of model assessments, there's all the rubrics, there's past papers, all of that it can then draw upon.
Can I ask you a question on that? I've done the same thing using ChatGPT, a custom one. I've given it, here's 20 great ones, here's 30 bad ones, here's an in-between, I've given it all the prompts, I've broken it down, make it a sequential. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many times I do it, by the time it gets through 20 of them, it starts getting generic. Those marks starting getting closer and closer to, it's like it doesn't want to go, that's really good, that's really bad. All the marks start getting very similar. Did you find that, or did you find?
No, but I did initially,
okay.
But then I started putting in a whole lot of additional prompts to have it. One thing it will tend to do is it looks back at its previous prompts, so I had to tell it not to do that, and then that then refreshes it, so it looks at the assignment as though it's a completely new assignment, and then builds on that process. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Oh, thank you.
So I'm conscious of time, and so I'll give the last question to someone from online. And they said, as a beginner, where do I start?
I would pop onto ChatGPT and just start talking to it. Just having a conversation with it and just seeing. And then the advice I always give to my students is pick something that they're having difficulty with. So in teaching, it might be, say, behaviour management, and see if it can come up with advice on how to address something that you're having troubles with. So I'm having troubles with getting reluctant students to engage with conversations. I was asking it how to approach that problem. And that's certainly the advice I'm giving to my pre-service teachers. Use it to address issues that you've got, and use it as a brainstorming tool to bounce ideas off.
So I need to go into ChatGPT and say, how do I learn how to use it?
And you can do that. How can I write the best prompt to do this task? You don't have to think of it yourself anymore. It will assist you in doing any of the tasks you need to do to use ChatGPT.
So thank you so much for attending today, given it was also rainy. And also thank you for those online who logged in today.
I think they're up there.
We're up there. I'm probably standing so the camera can't see me. I've been told to move. No more.
Look up there.
But can we just give a very warm round of applause to Jason and thank him for his presentation and the time that he's taken to speak to us today.
Thank you.
So keep your eyes out for the ongoing advertising around the lecture series. Next week we hear from people in environmental sciences about the ways in which they're using AI tools in learning and teaching. But thank you everyone for today. Any questions or concerns, please just reach out to CCEE about your registration, things like this. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.